Hello, everybody. Welcome and welcome back. I know to many of you. Um, my name is James Donnelly, and I'm the founder and the CEO of Casa Group. And again, this week, we're very lucky to have Donna Berger, shareholder and attorney extraordinaire from Becker. Donna, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So this is episode 11, Donna, believe it or not. And very interesting to me that our registration for this webinar is consistently staying, around 400 people, which means the appetite for advice just keeps being there for us. And with what's happened in the last week, I think we're going to have lots of great questions. Just a reminder to our participants today, we're now doing this every 2 weeks. So next one will be July 8th. And we've had a lot of requests of how do we see past episodes, Donna, and that's, you can just go to casgroup.com, click on our COVID banner, and it'll get you to our past episodes. If you have any questions for Donna or I, or materials that we may mention, just email info@casgroup.com and we'll get those to you. Two quick reminders. One is sometimes we have some people that lose their connection. And it's like when I go to the IT department every day, Donna, they just say, turn your computer off and turn it back on.
Reboot, yeah.
And also, Donna, every week or 2 weeks now is really generous with her knowledge, but it's a reminder to everybody that she's not giving any of us legal advice. Maybe some of her clients that are listening will sneak away with that, but I think that what it's really going to help you with is the right questions to ask your attorney. So with that, the agenda today, we started polling 2 weeks ago, and Don, I'm going to show, we're going to start showing the trending, and obviously there's only 2 data points this week, but in fact, it's up on the screen there now. So the red line is the pool opening percentage. And I know some of you are saying, what's HOA, what's condo, what's 55 plus. At this point, with 2 data points, we're not going to get that detailed, although we are going to ask those questions today. So you can see people are opening their pools. And then the second one is face mask required. Unfortunately, that line is going down. And the third one is clubhouse or common areas, and that's staying pretty consistent. So none of that information, Donna, really surprises me. Can you see that on the screen?
Yeah, I can see it. The face mask surprises me somewhat, James, and I'm wondering if that's because of an enforcement issue, that our boards are finding it difficult to enforce the facial covering, and I'm sure we'll get into it, but that line is actually going in the opposite direction of now what our local officials are saying, particularly in the Tri-County area. I'm sure you know Palm Beach now has made it mandatory because the numbers are just going in the wrong direction.
Yeah, we're going to talk a lot about that. And in fact, you bring legal advice, and we have some great experience in the last couple of weeks of what's happening and on the enforcement front. So I'm looking forward to getting to that. So that's the trend data. We're going to do polling. We're going to give you a little update and talk about the that's happened in the last week and what that means. And then backed by popular demand and good pressure on you, Donna, we're going to do the lightning round so we can get as much information to our audience in as short a period of time.
Let's do it. Absolutely.
Yeah. And then, of course, your questions, and when we receive a couple hundred of them in advance, all around the challenges of opening our communities. So with that, I'd like to start the polling, and let's put up question 1, Ness. This is where we're trying to categorize for you, our audience. And so the question is simply, what type of community are you living in? And I've also had some questions, Don, about how many people are responding to these, and are they statistically valid? So as I said, we have between 300 and 400 participants, and we're getting over 200. Well, there's 200 people answering each question. So for sure, we're getting statistically valid data for our audience.
Well, and they can't vote twice. So right. You vote once. Look, I grew up in Chicago. I think my dad used to say, vote early and vote often, but you can't vote twice on this. So I think that that keeps it pretty honest.
It's true. So we've had over 200 vote for that, and we've got 58% condo, 42% HOA, and 61% are not adult communities, and 39% are, which actually is an overweight there because 39% of communities in Florida are not adult, but clearly our audience today is. So great data, and we will share some more information as we go along with that. So Donna, I want to just kind of give an update from our last session, and I want to, I guess, applaud you once again. You've been, I think, if I were to characterize your advice, it's been biased towards keeping restrictions in place. And I think the surge that has happened in the last week or two has proven you right, and we're going to talk a bit about that.
I might object to the use of your word biased, although I will say on my social media channels, James, I actually posted yesterday that if you live in a community where your board took reopening slowly, you should thank them after having looked at the COVID numbers recently in Florida. So I do feel strongly that a debt of gratitude is owed to the boards that really withstood a tremendous amount of pressure and said, we're not going to, rush to reopen until we can properly manage this thing. And I think the numbers are bearing that out.
Well, you're right. And, a lot of the questions we keep getting every week or every 2 weeks, Donna, are my residents are pressuring me. My residents are pressuring me. What should I do? And I think the evidence has shown that hanging tough was the right decision. In terms of, I always like to update our audience on regulatory updates. And the facts are that, first of all, the facts are in California, Texas, and Florida today, they've all had over 5,000 new cases, which is just a remarkable number. And none of them have had regulatory updates at the state level. So we are getting some updates on more local regulation. I think Palm Beach County went for masks yesterday. Mm-hmm. I do want to bring up the July 7th executive order that expires July 7th about emergency orders. And tell us, I know you wrote a letter to the governor. Tell us what July 7th means and what was the nature and purpose of your letter, Donna.
So the governor originally declared a state of emergency, James, on March 9th. Now, over the last few months, that emergency has been extended. The orders have been expanded, but the drop dead date right now is July 7th. And as you know, James, one of the hats I wear is executive director of CALL, or the Community Association Leadership Lobby. That's a group that Becker created back in 2003. The genesis for that group really was high-rise sprinklers way back then. Remember that? I'm sure we've got some people listening today that's another issue. We talked about going forward with this series. There's a lot of other things to talk about. And actually the sprinkler deadline is one of them, but we'll get into that in a later episode. But that was the genesis for CALL. And since that time, CALL has worked on various legislative initiatives at the state level. One of the things that concerns us greatly is that if that state of emergency is not extended past July 7th, we may have boards particularly in the Tri-County area, Miami-Dade, Broward, West, and Palm Beach, that continue to have their numbers grow. They may even have active infections in their community or quarantine situations, and they may not have the ability to exercise emergency powers. I say that saying that if the state of emergency is extended, James, you need to speak to your association attorney to ask what that means. And if it's not extended, you need to speak to your association attorney to see what that means and what you still can do to safeguard your residents.
Well, it's a good point. But I think that it would be a terrible thing, especially in what's happened with the surge in the last week, to not extend that. I know that you've written a letter to the governor. Do you think our audience, who are mostly board members, should be communicating to their local reps in the governor's office about extending the emergency powers? Is that a good recommendation to our audience right now?
It's an excellent recommendation. You can find my letter to the governor on www.callbp, as in BeckerPolycoff.com. For clients who are listening, that's going to be an alert going out on a fireworks bill, and that letter is going to be in there. But basically what we said to the governor, the gist of the letter, James, was, look, we don't want to stand in the way of reopening the economy. We understand how vital that is. But these are private residential communities, and they are not giving boards the tools to continue to safeguard their resident populations is not going to truly impact the economy. These are not commercial entities. These are not businesses. This is just common sense. The governor has said that it's vital to safeguard our vulnerable population, and he's focused on nursing homes and assisted care living facilities. But as you and I well know, and many of the people listening are probably nodding their heads, we have what's called aging in place in condos, where people moved into these condos maybe in their 40s or 50s or 60s, and now they're in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. So we do have some conditions in communities, particularly in our 55 and over, but not just limited to the 55 and over communities, where we have very vulnerable residents. And if the state of emergency goes away, the board's opportunity to safeguard those residents is greatly diminished. So to your point, James, contact the governor. You can look on my call alert to get the contact information, or you can go on the state's website and just Google, how do I contact Governor DeSantis? The phone number and the email will come up. Contact him and tell him how important it is that that state of emergency be extended, at least until these numbers start moving in the right direction.
I had it in my lightning round, but I'm just going to move it forward because you're talking about it. Briefly, because we've talked about it in prior, but I know we have some new audience members. The conflict between DBPR, Department of Professional Business Regulation, and the governor's executive order. What should our audience be following?
Well, you know, it's funny. I'm not so sure there is a conflict. I suspect that there was some coordination at the state level where the DBPR felt that by issuing that order rescinding emergency powers as of June 1st, that they were doing a good thing to reopen and re-stimulate the economy. But as I just said, these are private residential communities. These are not businesses, okay? So there is a disconnect there. But again, most association attorneys, myself included, have said that as long as that state of emergency is in effect, your emergency powers are in effect, regardless of what the DBPR said. So we've got that going on until July 7th, and hopefully the governor heeds our call, and it will be extended for a couple more weeks until these numbers start going down. James, you said 5,000 new cases. That's on top of 2 weeks of 3,000, 4,000. These cases keep coming up, and I know we keep being told this is a result of testing. Sure, it's a result of testing, but most people get tested because they don't feel well. They're either symptomatic or they've been exposed to somebody who has tested positive, and this is a highly contagious disease.
So just a reminder to our audience, call to action. If you want to see Donna's letter, it's www.callbp.com. I think that the average age of those testing positive has fallen dramatically from the 60s to the 30s. And I think what we're seeing is a lot of our older communities still being very cautious. I see the questions coming through here, Donna, about should we kind of back off our opening at this point, and we're going to talk about that. It's interesting what Sweden did was they basically locked down the older population and put every safeguard possible in place, and then didn't worry about the younger folks because they were going to go and do their things. And I hate to generalize, but that's what the data shows. So I think that's probably where we're heading, is that it's going to be really difficult to get people who aren't worried about COVID to comply, but it's going to put more emphasis on us to make sure that our communities of older people are well safeguarded. And I just want to stop there, because I think what we're realizing now, and I think you and I have talked about for 11 weeks, this is now a long-term reality. This is like this little episode we're going to have for 3 months, and then it was going to go away. It appears to me, and love your opinion, Donna, that until we get a vaccine, this is our reality. It's not going to go to zero. So in terms of our decision making as board members, we really need to think, what are we going to do for the next 12 months? Because that's probably how long, and by the time they make a vaccine and get it distributed. Just comment on kind of the different viewpoint that this is really not, it's no longer temporary. It needs to be a 1-year plan or more for our communities. And if it's shorter, great. But thoughts?
Well, you just hit the nail on the head. We have to start thinking about the long game here. Yesterday, I wrote a blog about how is this pandemic going to play out in terms of building design. Architecture has to address not only your present needs when builders build these buildings, but they should be taking into account future unknown challenges. Now, what's going to happen over the next 12 months? Well, hopefully some boards are going to, and I already know with my own clients, they're starting to engage in renovation projects, necessary repair projects, and certainly for our older high rises, they're going to have to start thinking about installing those engineered life safety systems. One thing you can start doing, James, look, we're not going to be able to widen corridors or make elevator cabs bigger. New buildings, I'm thinking, are going to start taking into account, how do we create a building where we live together but can possibly remain apart when we're dealing with these pandemics? But for our existing buildings, there may be some things you're doing, you should be thinking about it. If you're going to be renovating the lobby at some point, you may want to think about traffic flow. You may want to think about installing automatic opening doors. You may want to figure out if you can use some technology around the pool where you don't have to use a pool gate, a gate to open. Maybe there's an automatic system that you can install. So when our boards over the next few months are thinking about this, they should be asking their engineer, their architect, their design professional, are there things we can be installing that could have made it easier for us to contend with a shelter-in-place order? And from a financial standpoint, James, and this is where Castle is going to become so important with budget and reserves, should we be putting aside money for these kind of things?
Well, that's a great point. And in fact, doors and or high-touch surfaces in our communities are a big concern. And there is technology available. Obviously, it costs some money, which will be budgetary. But okay, I think the main point here is long-term view. If you recall, Donna, we kind of started this with a framework to respond to COVID and then a framework to reopen. And that framework was really often driven about regulation, but I actually think it's now more driven to common sense. You have to wear your mask. You have to socially distance. You have to have appropriate cleaning protocols. End of story. You don't need regulation to know. That is just common sense. And we're going to get into enforcement because I can see from the questions coming through, we know that, James, but how do we enforce it? But I want to jump to poll question 2 and 3 now to help our audience see who's participating today. Poll question 2 and 3. And I did, Donna, have someone ask for me to repeat that call website. I believe it's callvp.com.
Yep, that's it.
Okay. So the questions we have up right now are, if you live in an HOA, have you opened your pool, your gym, and your clubhouse? Okay, we're starting to get some good data come in here. So, yeah, without waiting for all of it to flow through, it looks like in terms of pools in HOAs, we've got 50% open, 18% not, and not applicable, I assume means you don't have a pool. One of our audience members asked us to add not applicable last week, so we're very good listeners here. Gyms, 17% open, 38% not, and the rest don't have gyms. And we have clubhouse, 11% open, 56% no, and 33% NA. So bottom line here is we have most pools, the majority of pools open. We have, of the people who have gyms, it's about a third open, and then not many people opening their clubhouses. And since we're doing polling, we might as well get the condo out, which is up on the board there now. If you are a condo board member or resident, please answer now.
James, while they're answering that, right before I stepped in here, I watched Governor Cuomo's. They've kind of cut away. They haven't carried him as closely, but just so our audience members are aware, the governors of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut have now issued quarantine orders for people coming from Florida, Texas, and Arizona. So we may find that our residents down here from New York who have other homes in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut may be staying with us in Florida a little bit longer because if they go home to those states coming from a state like Florida with a surge in COVID numbers, they are going to be required to quarantine for 14 days back up north.
This is the ultimate irony. Of course, we quarantined New York when they had their surge, and they're returning the favor to us. Okay, condos, 66%. It's really around 80% of condo pools are open because of it not applicable. And gyms, 41%. These aren't surprising numbers. And then, of course, your common area, your clubhouses were not. So this is really consistent, Donna, with what we've been talking about in terms of our framework. If it's an outdoor venue where you can have social distancing and you have the appropriate monitoring and cleaning, it's probably okay to open even now. And that's what's happening. But in closed spaces like clubhouse and common rooms, there's just the risk seems so high that that's why people aren't opening them. And then gyms seem to fall halfway between there. I can tell you, I have a beautiful gym in our condo, and there's no way I'm going in there. So, and they have a 10-person rule, and it's a big gym. Speaking of that, I live in a high-rise, Don, and I look down on an apartment building that has a rooftop pool, and it's a young community. And I couldn't believe it this weekend that I'm calling them kids because I'm old enough to be able to call them that. They were packed in with no masks. It was unbelievable. I think that's
well, and packed in with a younger demographic that we're now understanding that the younger population is testing positive. That not all of them may be symptomatic. It may be a slight cold for them or no cold at all. Although some of them will get sick, but the reality is those younger people then go out and mingle with a more vulnerable population. Across the board, it could be a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, it really could. Donna, by the way, if anyone wants to follow you on social media, how do they do that?
Oh, on social media, I'm on Twitter at Condo and HOA Law. I'm on Facebook. I've got 2 Facebook pages. If you're my family or I went to high school, college, or law school with you, it's Donna DiMaggio Burger, but it's Donna D Burger. D as in DiMaggio is my professional Facebook page, and I post a lot of information and resources. So if you're on Facebook, look me up, Donna D Burger. Otherwise, you're going to be with all my high school and college and law school friends.
I think I got locked into both of those. So, by the way, if you have any questions about websites or whatever, info@castgroup.com, we'll get it right back out to you. The other thing I wanted to remind everybody, because it's possible, even based on today's suggestions, some of our boards may be changing their policies related to COVID, and it's still something they should ratify at a board meeting and get their attorney to approve. Don, I just wanted you to reinforce that.
I've done many of those resolutions, James, where boards had to, on the fly, create those protocols. Things were moving fast and furiously. My recommendation would be that's great, that's fine, but now make sure you ratify it with the proper board resolution. Speak to your attorney on how to do that.
Okay, I got some great poll questions. I know the audience is going to love the answers, so I'm going to keep getting them out here. Let's have number 4 up there, Ness, please. And then we're going to go to the lightning round. And while people are voting, Donna, you and I talked yesterday about emotional support animals, and I can't remember whether it had a COVID angle to it, or was it just that the bill was before the governor, and I know you were a supporter of that bill. Is there anything, while people are voting, you want to comment on?
Well, the only COVID angle may be that more people feel they're in need of an emotional support animal under these stressful times. But yes, there is a bill pending before the governor. He has until the end of this month to act on it. The bill does have a July 1st effective date. We have every reason to believe that the governor will sign this bill or allow it to become law without his signature. In my opinion, it's a game changer, James. Well, it's a step in the right direction at the very least. It's a game changer at the most. And the reason is this: it criminalizes fraudulent emotional support animal requests. Yes, you still have to prove that there was fraud involved, but it may make people who in the past have been very cavalier about submitting these fraudulent claims in pet restricted communities, they may think twice. It also penalizes the medical professionals who write these letters, and that's really where the abuse is coming from. It holds people with emotional support animals responsible for any damage that those animals may do. We're going to be wrapping this up in our call legislative guidebook. I'm sure attorneys throughout the state, if this bill passes, are going to be discussing it. We teach a class called, is a no pet building a thing of the past. But this bill is something that Call pushed really hard for. We had a specific advocacy campaign called Honest ESA. And, I'm delighted that the bill passed, and I just have my fingers crossed that it becomes law. And then we can talk in a future episode about operationally what you need to change in terms of your paperwork and applications.
Yeah, we're getting some great inventory of ideas for future episodes, and I really thought we'd be moving to some of those already, but with this surge, I think we need to stay on point. So our adult communities, 55 and better, we call them, Donna, we got pools, 40% open, 14% no, 46 not applicable. 55 plus gyms, 10% open, and 55 plus clubhouses, 4%. And that's true of our clients. I mean, in adult communities, it's the high risk profile, indoor amenity. It is, I think, a good. I'm not surprised to see 4% open.
But James, let me ask you. In addition to the higher risks, or at least the perception that there's a higher risk of potentially acquiring the disease in an interior space with multiple surfaces, do you also get the feeling that there's less pressure on boards to open the gym as opposed to the pool? I have to tell you, from my experience, not everybody living in a building is a gym rat. Not everybody loves to work out and use the gym. But I would say most people like to sit out in the sun, myself included, grab some rays. We're in the middle of summer here. Do you think that there's a correlation between the two, that there's just more demand for the pool as opposed to the gym?
100%. In fact, if you go into any condo, and I guess the same is true of the adult communities with their beautiful clubhouses, okay, there's a subset of the population that's something they do every day, and it's a big minority. But there's very few people who don't want to go to the pool at some point. So that's true, and I think that's why the pressure is mostly on the pools. Okay, I'm going to put you on the spot here with some lightning rounds, and to the audience, I see your questions coming through. I'll try and include some of these in the lightning round. But first of all, there's 2 or 3 questions up here already. Donna, do we give credits for closed amenities?
Do we give credits for closed amenities? No.
Yeah.
And I'll just say briefly why no. Because your need to ensure that amenity, your need to maintain that amenity remains, and you've acquired other expenses at the start of this pandemic that you wouldn't otherwise have. So it's a slippery slope. There's nothing legally that would support your reason to give credits. There's no legal way to get you where you want to go there. And again, this is going to fall under the category of no good deed goes unpunished. So just don't do it.
I agree with that. And in fact, we are finding there are some additional expenses, right from, the PPE expenses, right when this all came and the supply chain hadn't normalized, we were paying like $1.50 for a mask, and now they're 40 cents. So those were unbudgeted items. In fact, I think there's a higher probability that there may be a special assessment to deal with having to restructure our community for this than there is for credit on your budget.
Well, to that effect, I would say this, and I've said it before, James, if you are listening and you still haven't opened your pool or your gym and you're getting an incredible amount of pressure, or let's say you're considering closing it, that would be a great poll question in 2 weeks, James. Have you reclosed your pool? Because depending on where these numbers are going, we might start seeing closures again. Survey your people. Ask them, are you willing to pay a special assessment in the amount of 500 per unit or 1,000 per unit or whatever it may fall out to be, depending on your community size, in order to open the pool and pay for the proper cleaning and monitoring? Find out if they support it. You really have to educate your people. The other poll question, survey question that I suggest that our boards put in front of their membership is, knowing that we don't have insurance coverage for COVID-related claims, do you still support reopening the pool? Or do you still support reopening the gym? And lay it out there for them. Doesn't mean you have to follow what the survey says, but it would be really interesting for people to see in black and white what this would mean to the residents. I think in some cases, they're not really understanding the big picture.
Well, it's a great point. The consistent message we're getting from our boards is, and it's usually a minority of the community, but they're the vocal minority. Pressure, 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 let's open. And so we're trying to put some tools in the toolbox of our boards as to how to deal with that pressure. And this is one you came up with 2 weeks ago. Ask the residents. Yes, we can do that, and we need to monitor the pool, and the price of that is X. And are you willing to have a special assessment? Oh, no, we're not really.
Well, can't have it both ways. Okay, lightning round.
All right, next is, is there insurance? And I'm not asking you as an insurance expert, but I think you know the answer, and I got some questions up here. Do we have insurance for COVID-related damages?
For the damages, no. I don't know anybody who has coverage for the damages. Now, some of my clients have purchased separate gap policies for legal expenses. So if they get sued for any reason, including, let's say, bodily injury or wrongful death related to COVID, in those instances, the associations who have purchased that extra gap coverage, which is by no means typical coverage, okay, they would be covered for the legal defense to respond to the lawsuit. But any damages or any settlement, that would be out of pocket.
And that's why you would ask they could survey their residents with that fact. But it does bring up, I'm trying to get these questions that part of this lightning round. But then the question is, I'm a board member, am I liable? Maybe just address the fact that if we use the business judgment rule and we take appropriate steps, we should not have any liability as board members.
I say that, yes, but under 718-111-1D, there is personal director liability. I know people quake in their boots when I say this. If someone can prove that a director exhibited willful or wanton disregard for public safety. Now, I haven't come across any boards to date that have done that, but let me give you an example. We're still under a state of emergency. Let's say you have 2 infections in your community you know of. You keep the pool open and you don't have monitors and you don't do cleaning. That very well may lay the groundwork for a claim that the directors who voted to do that exhibited a wanton or willful disregard for public safety. I mean, operating in a pandemic, knowing you have infections in your community, let's say you're 55 and over, you got the pool open and it's not being monitored or cleaned, that's pretty willful. So that may be a problem, but that would be the exception. For most boards who are trying to do the right thing, they don't have an infection in the community, they've got the proper monitoring and cleaning in place, they've reached out to council, they've created protocols, you are going to be protected. Most likely, every set of documents I've ever seen requires an indemnification for the board members in the course of doing their duty. And as we've been saying from episode 1, James, the courts generally give wide deference to board decisions under the business judgment rule. You have to be really out there in terms of what you're doing. Your actions have to be egregious for a judge to try to second guess what the decisions the boards were making in the best interest of the community.
Agreed. A quick question that came through. They were questioning whether, in fact, the board needed to pass a resolution of a COVID policy. And keep in mind that a lot of these policies we're putting in place is under the emergency order requirements. So I know I'm answering and asking the question at the same time, but yes, the board should approve whatever policy they've decided on once their attorney has looked at it.
Well, I take that a step further because the emergency powers in 718, 719, and 720 uses the term disaster plan, okay? And there's a lot of different components that can go into that disaster plan, which could include a limitation on guest visitation for contractors, for realtors, for non-essential visitors. So I advise my clients, James, that we put that under the term disaster plan. Why do I like that? Because that language tracks what the statute says. And the closer you can track what the statute says, I think the better off you're going to be if you're challenged.
Excellent point. And by the way, I've had a couple comments come in. I'm recommending calling attorneys too often, and that's going to cost us money, which is true. But it leads me to, I want to throw out, Ness, our poll question number 5, because it's related specifically whether your association has contacted your attorney for coronavirus advice. And 1, question 2, has your association been party to any coronavirus-related litigation yet?
You know, I know no one likes to call us, James, but here's the thing. You can call us now and it's going to be a smaller problem, or you can call us later when it's a really bigger and more expensive problem. And we're going to get into enforcement, but when I hear you can't enforce your COVID protocols, whether it's facial coverings, the pool or gym being closed, you know what I'm really hearing? We can't enforce this on our own via the honor system. And I agree with you. It's going to be very difficult. It's always difficult when you tell people what they can and can't do. But don't tell me you can't enforce this, because I will tell you at my firm, and I venture to guess firms throughout the state, association firms, we're enforcing this left and right. And normally we only need 1 or 2 test cases and everybody else falls in line. So don't say you can't enforce it. You just can't enforce it for free. You are going to have to, and that gets back to the survey, James. It's not just a question of a special assessment to pay for monitoring and cleaning. If you open things up, you better have enough money to contact the law firm when you have violators. These are not trivial violations. These are violations which put your residents at risk of contracting the disease, but it also puts your board at risk for getting sued for operating with a substandard duty of care.
So these results aren't surprising because this is our audience and we've been telling them to get advice, but 85% are seeking legal advice, which is great.
All right.
And I'm also not surprised that there's only 2% that have experienced any litigation. It's obviously early for that. Okay, thank you, audience. This is really helpful to us in terms of shaping content. Continuing on with my lightning round, take temperatures of residents and or guests or not, Donna?
No, I don't like it. Do you want me to expand briefly on why?
I think you have to, because there's 3 questions on this.
Okay, so when it comes to taking temperatures of employees, if the association has direct employees, I have a more favorable position towards that. The EEOC has come out, that's the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, has come out and said you can't require employees to take antibody tests. They're unreliable and it's medical testing. But you can still require temperature taking of employees and a test proving that they don't actually have the virus. Let's say you have an employee who's living in a household with an infected person. You can, as part of your employment protocols, require them to provide a test that they are not positive. And I'm sure you'll discuss what Castle's doing. When it comes to taking temperatures of visitors or residents, I am not at all in favor of it because the board is potentially acquiring a liability and an obligation that you wouldn't otherwise have. You're not medical experts. You're not obligated to become medical experts or fill that role. With temperature taking, it would have to be, you have to know that the device you're using is appropriate, that it's applied consistently and properly. You'd have to know that the person doing it is doing it well. You may get involved in a confrontation. Not everybody likes to have their temperature taken. I could envision, James, a situation where you may have an employee point that, if you're doing the laser scan where you point the gun and the beam at somebody's forehead, which is what most people are doing, that could potentially become an assault or a battery situation. A battery is an unwanted touching. I may have said no, so you better make sure you get permission. I would get permission in writing. Are you going to start doing all this before somebody enters your community? We need you to sign off on this. What if they say no? Does that mean you turn them away? There is a host of problems with temperature taking, and at the end of the day, it doesn't really make you any safer, because it just means somebody doesn't have a temperature. It doesn't mean they're not infectious. It can create a false sense of security. So across the board, you know what I think this is? I think this is one of those bandwagons that everybody's jumping on because they see other people doing it, and it seems like a cool way to calm, the nerves. And I'm telling you, it's not worth it.
Masks or no masks?
Absolutely with masks. And let me talk about masks for a second. I don't like masks, but here's the thing. I went through 5 different types of masks until I found one that was actually comfortable. I now have a mask, a couple different, and they're comfortable and they're fine, and I can breathe better in them. People try one mask, they hate it. I hated the first ones I tried. I get it. Here's the thing. Masks will help in terms of reducing exposure. Now we're getting people saying, I can't wear a mask. My doctor says I can't wear a mask. I kind of liken this, I hate to say, to the ESAs, which is, you know what? You tell me what you've got that you can't breathe for 5 minutes in any kind of mask. Another hat I wear is I serve on the American Lung Association board in Florida. Obviously, we deal with people with cystic fibrosis, with COPD, with asthma, with a host of significant and serious respiratory illnesses, James. And our position is it's important that you actually protect those people with those illnesses from COVID. So maybe you need to talk to your medical provider. Maybe a bandana that's open here is what you need. Maybe you need a face shield. But just saying I can't breathe is not the answer. Facial coverings is going to be, as we're seeing in Palm Beach, what is needed to halt this thing so we can truly reopen.
I think people better go find the one they like because it's going to be around for a long time. There is a question here about, are they required outside? And, our experience is inside they need to wear masks. Outside, if they're socially distancing, then they can take the mask off.
I agree with that. I wouldn't recommend any association say you need to sit at the pool with a mask on your face. That's counterintuitive. As long as you're enforcing social distancing, it's the same thing inside the gym, James. Requiring people to wear masks while they're doing cardio work, I just don't think that makes sense. The mask should be used as you're traversing the common corridors because they're typically narrow, or you're in the elevator because it's narrow. One question, do I need to wear a mask when I'm alone inside an elevator? I'm going to turn this on you. What do you think? Yes or no?
I say no.
I say yes, and I'll tell you why. Because you may be alone in the elevator. What if you cough or sneeze all over the buttons?
Well, then I put it on.
Afterwards?
No, but we're really going to sneeze. So, I never take mine off. As soon as I get out of my car, I put it on until I get into my condo.
I never know when I'm going to sneeze. It happens just instantaneously.
Okay, so a question was about employees, and the answer is yes, employees should wear masks. And also, we've had an uptick in our employee infections. For the first 2 months, we had none. And ever since the last 30 days, and in fact, the last 2 weeks, we have. Guess why? Because our teammates are at the front desk, and we have more people with infections. So I would ask all our boards to be, first of all, insist that all your team wear masks if they're in the same places that the residents are. Obviously, if they're in their office with the door closed, that's different. And also, the other thing I get asked a lot is, why can't we have the management office open? Well, the management team is usually there in most of our communities, but there's a reason the door's shut, because you don't want just people walking in. And so by appointment, a good policy to use for your residents.
You got to keep your management staff healthy and safe. You don't want them getting exposed to anything where then they now have to call out and quarantine for 14 days.
Well,
So to the extent you should keep your office closed, those questions can be handled by email or phone call, or as you suggest, James, by appointment.
Yeah, and don't forget that the employees interact with so many different people. If one of them gets infected, it could be even worse than a resident getting infected.
That's right.
Okay, access, yes or no guests?
Well, doesn't really lend itself to a yes or no. So at this point, because we've got so much open, yes, with guests, but with certain guidelines. Okay, let's talk about the difference between an HOA and a condo or a cooperative in a multifamily building. In an HOA with single family homes or even attached or semi-attached townhouses, I think at this point, I don't know whether restricting guests in an HOA is necessary at this point. Again, unless you are 55 and over, you have active infections. I think you're probably safe with allowing guests, unless you're talking about a huge construction crew with, over a dozen people. Remember, the CDC is still saying we should limit any gatherings to 10 or fewer people. That's that. In a multifamily building, yes, I think you can probably take your foot off the brakes a little bit on that. But find out who the guest is, how long they're going to be staying, where they're coming from. I don't know that you want guests coming from Texas and Arizona right now and staying overnight. And you still need to be mindful, James, of the outstanding county orders. Broward County their order regarding the pools still says no guest usage. So you better make sure if you're allowing guests that you're making sure that you're not allowing those guests to use the pool.
That's a good point. I've been reminded here that I didn't ask the mask polling question under masks. So Ness, will you put up question 7 about masks? And while we're doing that, Donna, there's been a couple questions about notifying residents of a resident or an employee infection. And the answer we have, because we have, I think, with 7 employees with infection, we of course tell everybody and what we're doing about it, and we have a plan to make sure that the community knows. And similarly, if it's a resident, we let them know. Now, we don't say who they are, what their name is, but while the polling is going on about the mask, just give us your lightning answer to what we should tell the community about an infection in the community.
Certainly. Well, listen, whether it's an employee infection or a resident infection, notification is important. But after you know, and again, notification after you've received credible information about an infection. And remember, there's 2 sources of credible information on an infection. It's either that the person has notified you themselves that he or she is infected, or the Department of Health has contacted the association. That's really it. Rumor and innuendo, you should not be running off and notifying unless you have credible information. Assuming you have credible information that you have either an infected resident or a household that needs to quarantine because some member of that household has tested positive, then get with association counsel to craft the correct message. Notifying, you can ask the infected person, may we identify you? If they say yes, then you may want to do that. May we identify you for the purpose of contact tracing? I just had this come up. Somebody was at the pool. They left to go back to their home up north. But before they did, they were at the pool. They met with a lot of different people. Do we now have an obligation to contact all those people? The answer is, if that person had said, yes, you may disclose my name, then we would have done so. That person specifically said, no, you may not use my name. The next question to that infected person is, well, then will you do contact tracing yourself? And, I'm venturing that person is not going to do contact tracing themselves. At that point, really, everybody has to assume that if you're using the common areas in the midst of a pandemic, that you are coming across any number of people who are potentially contagious. And disclosing a name, again, creates potentially a false sense of security. If it were me and I were living in a multifamily building and I received notice that there was either an employee infection or a resident infection, I would contact my medical provider, certainly if I wasn't feeling well, but even if I was feeling well, I would contact my medical provider and find out about whether or not I should take a test.
Donna, I'm going to give the results here for the math. For HOAs, I've got 24% yes, 25% no, 51 not applicable. Condos, that's lower than I thought. 33% in condos. I need to talk to you, boards. No, 22 not applicable, 45, and then our adult communities 55, 22% yes, 15% no, and I think that's really reflecting that they're HOAs for the most part. And you reminded me to make this distinction again. Really, if you can drive your car into your community, into your driveway, into your house, that's a completely different set of circumstances. I mean, you could not have a mask on in your car, and you could walk from your car to your house and never have to have a mask. Versus a condo where you got to park your car, get in the elevator, go through a common area. But I'm a little surprised at the condo low numbers here, Donna, on mask wearing.
Well, I'm terribly surprised, particularly if those numbers reflect condos in the Tri-County area, where we have a huge increase. But listen, numbers are increasing in Pinellas and Hillsborough. They're increasing throughout the state. Is there any downside? Let me put it this way: is there any downside to requiring facial coverings just when you leave your unit, to walk through the corridors, to get in that elevator and exit the building? My answer would be, I don't see a downside to that. These people are getting in their cars and then driving to Publix or Walgreens or any other store and having to put the mask on. So why is it so difficult to say, I have an equal obligation, not just when I go to Publix or Walgreens or anywhere else, but in my own community where I'm, again, I got back to that design question that I asked at the outset, James, which is many of these buildings are designed with narrow corridors, small elevator cabs, and there's no real ability to social distance. If you had the ability to safely social distance, you wouldn't have to wear the facial covering. But you know your building. If you can't, look, if you're walking down the corridor and nobody's around you, yeah, but the second you see somebody, put the mask on. It's for your protection and theirs. If you have a mask covering requirement and people aren't complying, contact your attorney. We will happily write a letter to the violators telling them what the problem is and the litany of things that can happen legally as a result, including fines, suspensions. By the way, now that stuff is reopened, we can suspend you from using a reopened amenity if you don't comply with these protocols.
Well, let's jump into that. In fact, I'm going to do two things here, Donna, because the last whole question I think is going to be very interesting to people in terms of who should we let in our community. But I want to kind of end with this whole enforcement and what should we be doing. So Ness, put up question 6, please, as it relates to access. Who are you letting into your communities? And that's for HOA and condo and adult. Yeah, if you go down to the bottom of that, it'll have the adults communities as well. But Donna, I want to just, people are saying, well, how do we enforce these? So we come up with a policy, we've had it well thought out, we've approved it at the board, we've got our attorney's approval, and I've got owners not cooperating. And I just want to give a couple of anecdotal experiences we've had. Number one, communication is the best thing you can do to get compliance, again and again and again. 2, yes, you can issue violations. And this past week, we got our first court-approved injunction against a resident for non-compliance. So to your point, and I'm going to let you expand on that, there are some tools in our tool belt for enforcement. Before that, let's just look at how we're doing here. So in HOAs, we're letting contractors and realtors in about 60%, Donna. Mm-hmm. Family, of course, 80%, other non-essential guests, 65%. So people are letting guests in the HOAs, which probably makes sense. And then in the condos, we got contractors at 60, realtors at 53, family at 61, and non-essential guests at 60. The non-essential guests is higher than I thought. And then for adult communities, we've got contractors, 57, 50, 67, 63. They're actually not that much different between them. So Donna, talk to me. How do we enforce our rules that we've appropriately got approved by our board and our attorney?
So I would say, listen, this is not business as usual. Would you agree? We are not enforcing a parking restriction or a noise restriction January 2020. We are June 2020, and we are dealing with a virus that continues to spread. So fines, you could do that in addition, but this is not something that you can, mull over. The board needs to act with a certain degree of urgency when they realize that they've got people violating the protocols, whether it's not wearing a facial covering, whether it's not observing social distancing at the pool, whether it's not cleaning down machines in the gym, whether it's they told you they were going to have a 2-person construction crew and now 12 people show up. Whether it's we're not allowing open houses, just in-person realtor showings, and you find out that the realtor is holding open houses. These are all non-trivial violations, and they should be reacted to swiftly. And I would say, forget the fine, forget the suspension, go directly to the attorney. And I know this sounds self-serving, but you know what? This is what you need to do. It's been my experience that it's like dominoes. One falls, most of the rest fall in line. When your community knows you're serious about enforcing your protocols, and that if you violate it, we're going to send it to the attorney, you're going to get a demand letter. And to your point, we've also gotten emergency injunctions, James, and we're seeking our attorney's fees and costs from the violator. And many times the judge will grant the firm our attorney's fees and costs from the person who caused us to be in front of that judge in the first place. Can't guarantee that, but again, this is a cost of doing business in the midst of a pandemic. Another option is also to tell your owners, we're going to have to close things down if we continue to have violations. One thing you may tie the facial covering to, if you have a vulnerable population and people are not wearing the facial coverings, and that's part of your protocols, we're going to have to close the pool if all of our protocols are not followed. It doesn't just have to be a violation of the pool protocol, because by not wearing the facial coverings, the risk of exposure is greater throughout the building, which means those same vulnerable people are going to your pool. I use the example of the person who was infected, used the pool, and then left town. So I would say a real big stick would be to your owners that if you don't start wearing your masks, we're going to shut the pool.
Yeah, I think that's excellent. And we're going to run a couple of minutes over here, Donna, but we got some great questions on the board. First of all, I acknowledge in poll question 6, we had a little logistic issue. If you had to answer every question or you couldn't move on, even if you weren't in a HOA. So we will fix that for next week. Apologies for that. And I would say, the big thing, if there were one thing we could do in our communities, we've had a lot of questions about masks, is wear a mask. It's probably that and social distancing are the single biggest things that we could do. We had some quick questions here on tennis and pickleball and pools. I'm just going to rapid fire them out. You can tennis is allowed, doubles is allowed. We get asked doubles and pickleball. You can't socially distance doubles and pickleball. Can we have noodles and other equipment in the pool?
Well, to your point with pickleball, I guess if you've got people who don't mind wearing masks while playing pickleball because they can't socially distance, that's one option. I don't know how easy it is to wear a mask while social distancing, while playing pickleball. I understand it's not as not as challenging in terms of cardiovascular exercise, but that may be an option. Look, you want to get your people to go where they want to go, but you've got to do so in a reasonable manner.
Yeah. And on all the pool equipment, what we've seen a lot of our communities is, in a lot of our communities, the association would provide equipment, and then you're creating liability and a cleaning protocol requirement. My advice is allow owners to bring their own noodle or exercise equipment, but do not make it another risk point for the association.
Now make sure they leave it and make sure they take it with them. Listen, again, I keep going back to that no good deed goes unpunished category. If you allow people to bring their own noodles, certainly associations who in the past have had, an abundance of shuffleboard equipment, tennis rackets, pool toys, floats, all that should be stored away, because if you put association stuff out there, you're responsible to clean it and make sure it's being used properly. But even if you have people bringing their own, you want to make sure that they're removing it and they're not, because people are not always the most conscientious, and you want to make sure that that stuff is removed, because any surface, you just don't want it. You just don't want it there.
100% agree. My last point, because there's several questions about monitoring and enforcing common areas, and mostly pools. There's a cost to monitor, and there are firms, like security firms and management companies, that will hire the person to do the monitoring, but there's a cost associated with it. And this gets back to your surveying the owners. If they thought they could open up their pool, but it would cost, I'm making up a number, $50,000 to monitor it, I mean, that's a decision that the board could survey their owners for. I almost think we're going to have a COVID line in our 2021 budgets, which are starting as early as now. So Donna, we still have some more stuff. I want to talk some more about liability, but we have to leave something for 2 weeks from now. So
yeah. God only knows what we'll be talking about 2 weeks from now, but I'm happy we'll keep going with liability.
This surge, I think, should remind all of our board members listening that this is now a 12-month long-term strategy we have to come up with. We have to think about physical plan. We need to think about our budget. And we really need to think more about common sense than regulation. It's really not about regulation. It's what makes sense to keep your community safe. So with that, Don, I want to thank you again. And if anyone has any questions, info@castgroup.com. And also, if anyone needs to know, Donna, your social media contacts, then just send them in. We'll get them to our listeners. And also, I know.
You can also email me, James, at the firm. You can,
And then similarly, I know that both Becker and Castle love to get positive Google reviews. I see my team's reminding me on the screen right now. So if you've enjoyed what Don and I have shared with you today, we of course always welcome you to visit Google and give us whatever comments are appropriate. So everybody, thank you so much. I mean, the year 2020 is going to be the year board members go, what happened? And I admire and respect and appreciate your leadership in the communities, and I know Don and I are both very, very happy to be your partners, and if you are our clients. So we will talk to you in 2 weeks. We will send a survey out. The survey responses you're sending us are really helping us shape content, so fill them out. But with that, Donna, thanks again for your time. Always.
It's my pleasure. My pleasure. Stay safe, everybody, and stay strong.
Thank you, and have a great 2 weeks. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.